Jasmine stared at the check in disbelief. $1 million made out in her name. The frail white man she'd fed at her food truck for months wasn't homeless after all. "This city belongs to me," Charles Whitmore announced coldly, "and now your future does too. Before I dive into this shocking story, tell me where you're watching from today. Hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories about unexpected twists of fate. Would you take money from someone who had been deceiving you all along? Let's find out what Jasmine did when faced with this life-changing decision. The morning sun had barely crested over Atlanta's skyline when Jasmine Carter fired up the generator on her food truck Soul Food Express. The 23-year-old black woman had inherited her grandmother's recipes and entrepreneurial spirit, but not her grandmother's era of community support and affordable rent. Steam rose from the ancient coffee maker as Jasmine reviewed her dwindling bank account on her cracked phone screen. Another month of barely making ends meet. She tucked a stray braid behind her ear and began chopping collard greens with practiced precision, her knife moving in steady rhythm against the wooden cutting board. The food truck, painted in fading yellow and adorned with hand-drawn illustrations of traditional soul food dishes, was parked in its usual spot on Auburn Avenue, once the thriving heart of black business in Atlanta. Now glass and steel luxury apartment buildings loomed nearby, casting long shadows over the historically black neighborhood. New coffee shops with $8 lattes and trendy boutiques with unaffordable price tags had replaced the family-owned businesses Jasmine had grown up visiting. She glanced at her watch and quickened her pace. Her younger brother Marcus would be waiting for his breakfast before school. At 16, he was already facing challenges at Westridge Academy, an elite private school where he'd earned a partial scholarship. Just last week, he'd come home with reddened eyes after a teacher suggested he couldn't possibly have written his English essay without help. Jasmine had stayed up past midnight, helping him document his research process for the revised submission. The memory made her knife pause mid-chop. Their grandmother, Ida, had insisted on education as the path forward, but she hadn't prepared them for the constant need to prove themselves worthy of opportunity. The medical bills from Ida's diabetes complications had nearly bankrupted them last year. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses meant Jasmine had taken out a second loan against the food truck. The first customers began arriving at 6:30. Mr. Washington, a retired postal worker, ordered his usual black coffee and Johnny cakes. Miss Tanner, from the hair salon, wanted her biscuits and gravy to go. They were the regulars, the neighborhood stalwarts, who remained despite rising rents and property taxes. They chatted with Jasmine about community news, complimented her food, and sometimes left generous tips when they could afford it. "Girl, these greens taste just like my mama used to make," said Miss Tanner, closing her eyes in appreciation. "You keep this tradition alive, you hear me? They trying to take everything else." Jasmine nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of those words. By mid-morning, different customers arrived. Young white professionals in tailored outfits, construction workers from the new development sites, and occasional tourists seeking authentic experiences. Some were respectful. Others treated her like an exhibit in a cultural museum, asking if her food was truly traditional or suggesting ways to make it healthier. One woman had actually asked if Jasmine could make her collard greens less ethnic. It was during the midday lull when she first noticed him. An elderly white man in threadbare clothes pushing a rusty wheelchair with one squeaky wheel. His white beard was unkempt, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the counter. His pale blue eyes seemed watery and uncertain. "How much for a meal?" he asked, his voice surprisingly cultured despite his appearance. "Depends what you want," Jasmine answered, maintaining her professional smile while mentally calculating whether she could afford another charity case this week. She'd already given free meals to 3 neighborhood children whose families were struggling after recent layoffs. The old man patted his pockets, producing only lint and a subway token. "I seem to have misplaced my wallet," he said, embarrassment coloring his weathered cheeks. "Perhaps tomorrow." Something in his dignified manner, despite his circumstances, touched Jasmine. "Sir, I've got a plate of food that would just go to waste otherwise," she said, already reaching for a container. "Today's special is smothered chicken with mac and cheese and collard greens." His eyes widened with surprise, then gratitude. "You're very kind." "My name is Joe," he said, accepting the container with slightly trembling hands. "I'll remember this." Jasmine waved away his thanks. "Just pay it forward when you can, Mr. Joe. That's how we survive around here." The old man found a nearby bench and ate slowly, savoring each bite with closed eyes. When finished, he carefully returned the container and thanked her again before disappearing down the street. Jasmine thought little of it until he returned the next day and then the next. Each time he arrived without money, and each time Jasmine provided a meal. Sometimes they chatted briefly about the weather or neighborhood changes. Joe never revealed much about himself, but he listened intently to Jasmine's occasional comments about her struggles. 3 weeks after Joe's first appearance, Jasmine found an official-looking envelope taped to her food truck door. Inside was a notice informing her that the vacant lot where she parked had been purchased for redevelopment. All mobile vendors had 30 days to vacate. Panic seized her chest. She'd spent years building clientele in this location. Moving meant starting over, losing regular customers, and possibly failing entirely. The food truck was her only source of income, supporting herself, Marcus, and contributing to grandmother Ida's care. Without it, they'd lose everything. As Jasmine stood frozen, staring at the notice, a sleek black car with tinted windows drove slowly past her truck. She caught a glimpse of someone watching her through the partially lowered window before the vehicle accelerated away. The sight sent an inexplicable chill down her spine, as though she were being evaluated by unseen forces. That evening, as she closed up shop, Joe appeared again earlier than his usual time. "You seem troubled today," he observed, his pale eyes studying her face. Jasmine hesitated before showing him the eviction notice. "They're pushing all of us out," she said bitterly. "Another luxury development nobody from here can afford." Joe examined the paper carefully. "Whitmore Enterprises," he read aloud. "Yes, they're quite aggressive in acquisition." Something in his tone made Jasmine look at him more closely, but his expression remained sympathetic and neutral. "You know them?" she asked. "Only by reputation," Joe replied, handing back the notice. "Perhaps you could fight this." Jasmine laughed without humor. "With what resources? People like me don't win against people like them." She served him the day's leftover gumbo, noticing how the setting sun cast long shadows across his weathered face. For a moment she thought she saw something calculating in his gaze, but it vanished so quickly she decided she'd imagined it. The black car passed by again as Joe was leaving, slowing momentarily before continuing down the street. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that these two new elements in her life, the mysterious Joe and the ominous vehicle, were somehow connected to the threat now facing her livelihood and her family's future. The Atlanta branch of First National Bank gleamed with marble floors and mahogany desks. Jasmine had spent the previous night preparing a detailed business plan, financial projections, and a presentation on why relocating her food truck represented a sound investment. She wore her only business suit, purchased second-hand and carefully tailored to fit her slender frame. Her braids were pulled back in a professional bun, and she carried her documents in a leather portfolio borrowed from Marcus's school supplies. The loan officer, a middle-aged white man named Richard Keller, barely glanced at her materials. "Miss Carter," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, "your current revenue simply doesn't support the loan amount you're requesting." Jasmine leaned forward. "My projections show that with a new location near the university, I could increase revenue by 30% within 6 months. I've included market research and letters from current customers willing to follow my business." Keller's smile didn't reach his eyes. "These projections seem optimistic. And your credit score was impacted by those medical bills last year." Jasmine had anticipated this objection. "I've never missed a payment on my existing loan. The medical circumstances were exceptional, and we need to consider risk factors," Keller interrupted. "The mobile food industry has a high failure rate, particularly in certain neighborhoods." The emphasis on certain wasn't subtle. Jasmine recognized the coded language. She'd heard similar phrases throughout her life at culinary school when her instructor had dismissed her thesis on the historical significance of soul food as too niche and not sophisticated enough, despite her extensive research. During apartment hunts when units were suddenly just rented upon her arrival, in job interviews before she'd saved enough to start her own business. The memory of culinary school stung particularly sharp. Professor Harrington examining her award-winning sweet potato soufflé with pursed lips, commenting that while ethnic cuisine had its place, she might consider more elevated techniques if she wanted a serious career. Meanwhile, her white classmate Tyler received praise for his innovative interpretation of Southern classics dishes, remarkably similar to traditional soul food but with French names and smaller portions. After the fourth bank rejection that week, Jasmine sat in her truck fighting back tears of frustration. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus coming home late. "Mr. Peterson accused me of cheating on the math test. Meeting with principal. Another battle to fight." When Marcus had scored in the top percentile on the state math assessment, his teacher had immediately demanded he retake the test under supervision. When he scored even higher, the accusations shifted to having access to the answers beforehand. Their grandmother had taught them to be twice as good to get half as much, but even that math didn't add up anymore. Jasmine started the engine heading to Westridge Academy to support her brother. As she navigated traffic, a shiny BMW cut her off the driver, a young white woman glaring at the food truck as if its very existence offended her sensibilities. At a red light, the woman rolled down her window. "That truck looks like a health code violation," she called out with a smirk. "Shouldn't you people stick to your own neighborhoods?" Jasmine gripped the steering wheel tighter, maintaining her composure. The daily microaggressions accumulated like paper cuts, small individually but agonizing collectively. By the time she arrived at the school, the meeting had concluded. Marcus sat alone on a bench outside the administrative offices, his shoulders slumped. "They put me on academic probation," he said, without looking up. "Said my sudden improvement is statistically improbable unless I had outside assistance." Jasmine sat beside him, putting an arm around his shoulders. "We'll fight this," she promised, though the words felt hollow after a day of doors closing in her face. At home, their grandmother Ida listened to their stories with knowing eyes. At 78, she had lived through segregation, seen the false promises of equality, and watched as discrimination simply became more sophisticated rather than disappearing. "They think making the rules complicated means we won't understand the game," she said, her arthritic hands smoothing Marcus's hair. "But we've been watching them longer than they've been watching us." The next morning, Joe appeared at the food truck earlier than usual. Jasmine served him grits and sausage, noticing the careful way he observed her movements. "You seem troubled," he commented, echoing his words from days before. Something about his repetition struck her as rehearsed, but she dismissed the thought. "Just business challenges," she answered vaguely. Joe nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered approaching Whitmore Enterprises directly? Sometimes these large corporations have community outreach programs." His knowledge of her situation seemed oddly specific, but Jasmine was too preoccupied to question it. "Corporations like that don't care about businesses like mine," she replied. Joe's pale eyes studied her face. "What if you had something they wanted? Your recipes, perhaps. Your brand has authentic cultural significance that could be valuable to the right buyer." The suggestion made Jasmine uncomfortable. "My recipes aren't for sale. They're my grandmother's and her grandmother's before that." Joe nodded, as if her answer confirmed something for him. "Family legacy is important," he conceded before asking more questions about her upbringing, her culinary training, and her business challenges. The conversation felt increasingly like an interview rather than casual chat. That afternoon, Jasmine found an official envelope wedged under her truck's windshield wiper. The eviction notice had become a formal legal document, giving her exactly 30 days to vacate. It bore the gold-embossed seal of Whitmore Enterprises with an elegant signature at the bottom, Charles Whitmore, CEO. The timing after Joe's mention of the company seemed too coincidental. Jasmine searched online for information about Whitmore Enterprises. The corporation owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta, with subsidiaries in hospitality, retail, and technology. Charles Whitmore himself was a mystery. No photographs, no public appearances, only brief mentions of philanthropic donations to art museums and opera houses. Nothing for communities like hers. That evening, Jasmine attended a neighborhood council meeting at the community center. Dozens of small business owners and residents gathered to discuss the wave of evictions and displacement. A representative from the city's planning department listened with practiced sympathy to their concerns. "While we understand your attachment to this historic neighborhood," the representative said, "the redevelopment will bring jobs and economic growth that benefits everyone." An elderly barber who'd operated on Auburn Avenue for 40 years stood up. "We've heard these promises before," he said, his voice steady with dignified anger. "The highways that split our communities in the 60s were supposed to bring prosperity too. Instead, they destroyed black businesses and homes while connecting white suburbs to downtown jobs." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. When the meeting concluded, the community had secured nothing but vague promises to consider their input. Outside the community center, Jasmine noticed the same black luxury car she'd seen near her food truck idling across the street. As she watched, Joe emerged from the community center and walked toward the vehicle. He hesitated upon seeing Jasmine, then changed direction, disappearing around a corner. The car pulled away moments later. Jasmine stood frozen, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind. Joe's convenient appearance in her life, just as eviction notices were distributed. His probing questions, his knowledge of Whitmore Enterprises, the mysterious car. Something wasn't right. And with her family's future at stake, she needed to discover what or who she was really dealing with. What drives a billionaire to disguise himself as a homeless man? And how far would you go to protect your family legacy from those who want to erase it? Comment number 1. If you'd risk everything to stand up against powerful forces, trying to take what's yours. Like and subscribe to find out how Jasmine uncovers a web of deception that goes back generations. The Atlanta Public Library's archives section was nearly empty on Tuesday morning as Jasmine scrolled through digitized newspaper records. The name Whitmore appeared in yellowing society pages from the 60s chronicling charity galas and business acquisitions. She noticed a pattern emerging. Whitmore properties frequently appeared in neighborhoods shortly after urban renewal projects displaced black residents. One headline from 1967 caught her attention: "Redevelopment Authority Clears South Side for Progress." The accompanying photograph showed Charles Whitmore Sr., a tall white man with a stern expression, standing beside the mayor as bulldozers demolished a row of black-owned businesses. Jasmine zoomed in on the street sign visible in the corner of the image: Auburn Avenue, the very street where her food truck now stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she printed the article. The Whitmore fortune hadn't appeared from nowhere. It had been built on the systematic displacement of her community. The library's ancient printer hummed as Jasmine continued her research. Charles Whitmore Sr. had died in 1998, passing control of the company to his son Charles Whitmore Jr. Unlike his publicity-seeking father, the younger Whitmore was notoriously private. No photographs, no interviews, only press releases announcing business deals and charitable donations to exclusively white institutions. She discovered that Whitmore Enterprises had recently launched a downtown Renaissance initiative targeting historically black neighborhoods for revitalization. The corporate materials featured glossy renderings of wine bars, boutique hotels, and luxury condominiums replacing existing structures. Not a single image included the current residents or acknowledged the cultural heritage being erased. Jasmine closed her laptop and gathered her materials, her mind racing. Back at the food truck, the lunch rush kept her too busy for further investigation. She noticed Joe hadn't appeared for his usual meal. His absence felt significant after her morning's discoveries. As the crowd thinned, Jasmine received an email rejecting her application for the prestigious Atlanta Food Fair. The selection committee cited lack of innovation and limited market appeal, despite her submission featuring contemporary interpretations of traditional recipes. The same day, she learned that Authenticity, a new restaurant featuring elevated soul food, had been accepted. Its owner, Chad Williams, had visited her food truck multiple times, asking detailed questions about her techniques while claiming to be writing a food blog. The afternoon brought more disappointment. Marcus called, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They suspended me," he said without preamble. "Mr. Peterson said I was being confrontational when I brought in my study notes to prove I didn't cheat. Jasmine heard the hurt beneath his anger. At 16, Marcus was learning the brutal lesson that excellence didn't protect black children from suspicion. "Come to the truck," she told him. "We'll figure this out together." When Marcus arrived, his shoulders were slumped under the weight of injustice too heavy for his young frame. Jasmine served him sweet potato pie, their grandmother's comfort food recipe, and listened as he recounted how his teacher had accused him of having an attitude problem when he defended his academic integrity. As they talked, Joe appeared, moving slowly with his squeaking wheelchair. Seeing Jasmine wasn't alone, he began to turn away, but she called out to him. "Mr. Joe, this is my brother Marcus. Marcus, this is Joe. He's a regular." Something flashed in Joe's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation, before he smiled and extended a weathered hand to Marcus. "Your sister speaks highly of you," he said. "A mathematician, I hear." Marcus looked surprised. "She told you about me?" Joe nodded. "She mentioned a teacher failing to recognize true talent when presented with it. Unfortunately, that's a common story in this city." The specificity of his knowledge made Jasmine uncomfortable. She hadn't shared such details with Joe. As if sensing her suspicion, Joe changed the subject, commenting on the redevelopment signs that had appeared overnight on nearby buildings. "Whitmore has a particular approach to acquisition," he remarked. "They typically target areas with fragmented ownership, purchase key properties, then pressure remaining holdouts through various means, selective code enforcement, utility disruptions, even manipulating property taxes." The detailed knowledge seemed inconsistent with his homeless appearance. Marcus noticed it too, exchanging a glance with Jasmine. "You know a lot about corporate strategy for someone who—" Marcus let the observation hang unfinished. Joe smiled thinly. "I wasn't always in these circumstances. I worked in real estate development for many years." He turned to Jasmine. "Be careful with Whitmore. When they want something, ethical considerations rarely apply." After Joe left, Marcus voiced what Jasmine was thinking. Something's off about him. How does a homeless guy know so much about corporate tactics? That evening, Jasmine visited her grandmother, bringing dinner and updates about their situations. Ida Carter listened from her recliner, oxygen tubes in her nostrils, her once strong hands now twisted with arthritis. When Jasmine mentioned Whitmore Enterprises, Ida's expression changed subtly. "Carter property used to run from Auburn Avenue down to Edgewood," she said quietly. "Your great-grandfather had 3 buildings there: the barber shop, the print shop, and the apartment above. Good income, good legacy to pass down." Jasmine leaned forward. "What happened to it?" Ida's eyes clouded with old pain. 1965, they called it urban renewal. Sent papers saying they needed the land for a highway project. Offered pennies on the dollar, said we had no choice. Her voice hardened. Highway never came through there. 2 years later, Whitmore put up an office building instead. Same story all over the neighborhood. Black families pushed out white developers moving in. Jasmine's pulse quickened. "Do we still have any of those papers?" The original deeds or the correspondence about the takeover, Ida pointed to an old cedar chest in the corner. "Your grandfather kept everything. Said someday people might care about the truth." Inside the chest, beneath faded photographs and church programs, Jasmine found a folder of yellowing documents. Property deeds, tax records, and correspondence with city officials declaring eminent domain for a public works project that never materialized. Most significantly, she found a letter from Charles Whitmore Sr. to the City Planning Commission dated 6 months before the eviction notices outlining a private development opportunity if certain properties could be made available. The evidence of collusion was clear if decades old. As Jasmine drove home, a police cruiser pulled in behind her, food truck lights flashing. The officer approached, hand resting casually on his weapon. "We've received complaints about this vehicle," he said, not bothering to introduce himself. "Concerns about health code violations and illegal parking." Jasmine produced her permits and licenses, all current and legitimate. The officer examined them with obvious disappointment. "Still need you to move along," he said. "You're creating a traffic hazard." There was no traffic on the quiet street at 9 p.m., but Jasmine knew better than to argue. As she prepared to leave, she noticed the same black luxury car parked down the block, its engine running. When she looked directly at it, the car pulled away. That night, Jasmine couldn't sleep. The connections were becoming clear. Whitmore Enterprises wanted her neighborhood just as they had wanted it generations ago. Joe appeared suspiciously knowledgeable about their tactics. The police harassment began immediately after she started investigating. Something bigger than a simple eviction was happening, and her family was caught in its web again. Would you walk away from your family legacy for $1 million? Or would you fight a powerful enemy against impossible odds? Comment number 2, if you believe justice is worth fighting for no matter the cost. Like this video if you want to see how Jasmine uncovers the truth about Joe and his real connection to the Whitmore empire. The morning sunlight cast long shadows across Auburn Avenue as Jasmine prepared her food truck for another day of business. The eviction date loomed 2 weeks away, and despite her best efforts, no bank would approve a loan for relocation. While chopping onions for the breakfast service, she noticed Joe watching her from across the street. Unlike his usual approach, he stood observing occasionally, writing in a small notebook. When he saw her notice him, he tucked the notebook away and approached with his customary humble demeanor. "Good morning, Jasmine," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth she'd grown accustomed to. "Might I trouble you for some breakfast?" Jasmine served him grits and turkey sausage, studying his face more carefully than before. Behind the disheveled appearance and stooped posture, she noticed details that hadn't registered previously: the quality of his weathered leather shoes, expertly resoled, rather than cheaply made; the precise diction that occasionally slipped into his speech; the manicured nails on hands that claimed to be those of a homeless man. "How long have you lived on the streets, Joe?" she asked casually, watching his eyes. A microscopic hesitation. "Going on 3 years now," he replied, the rehearsed story flowing smoothly. "Economic downturn, medical bills, you know how it goes." But she did know how it went intimately, and something in his explanation rang false. Joe seemed to sense her skepticism and changed the subject. "I heard about a community meeting tonight regarding the Whitmore development. Will you attend?" The question seemed innocent enough, but combined with his earlier note-taking, it triggered Jasmine's suspicions further. "Probably," she answered non-committally. "Why do you ask?" Joe shrugged. "Just curious about how communities organize resistance. It's fascinating to observe." Observe. An unusual word choice that lingered in Jasmine's mind throughout the day. That afternoon, Jasmine welcomed food blogger Megan Winters to her truck. The white woman in her 30s had emailed requesting an interview about authentic Southern cuisine. Jasmine had agreed, hoping the publicity might help her relocation efforts. Megan photographed each dish, meticulously asked detailed questions about ingredients and techniques, and recorded Jasmine's explanations about the cultural significance of soul food traditions. "Your sweet potato pie recipe is incredible," Megan gushed. "Would you mind sharing the secret ingredient?" "It's just for my personal notes, not for publication." Against her better judgment, Jasmine revealed her grandmother's technique of adding orange zest and a touch of cardamom, a variation that had won local competitions for 3 generations. 3 weeks later, Jasmine discovered Soulful Roots, a new restaurant in the gentrified section of the neighborhood. Its owner, Megan Winters, advertised reimagined soul food classics, including a sweet potato pie featuring orange zest and cardamom, described as Megan's innovative twist on tradition. The menu included versions of Jasmine's signature dishes, stripped of their cultural context, and history repriced at triple what Jasmine charged. When confronted via email, Megan responded dismissively, "Recipes can't be copyrighted. Besides, I've elevated these dishes beyond their origins." The appropriation stung deeply, representing everything Jasmine fought against: the extraction of black culture without respect, credit, or compensation. The same week, Jasmine learned why her bank loan applications had been consistently rejected. A sympathetic loan officer at the 5th bank she'd approached revealed that her credit report showed a recent bankruptcy filing and tax lien, neither of which existed in reality. Someone had deliberately sabotaged her financial records. Repairing the false information would take months she didn't have. The systematic dismantling of her options couldn't be coincidence. As news of her situation spread, the community rallied around her. Mrs. Washington from the Neighborhood Association created an online fundraising campaign. Local musicians organized a benefit concert. Families brought home-cooked meals to show solidarity. The support was overwhelming, but Jasmine worried it wouldn't be enough against the corporate machinery determined to remove her. One evening, as Jasmine closed her food truck, she discovered racist graffiti sprayed across the service window, slurs and threats that made her stomach clench with equal parts fear and fury. She reported it to police, who arrived 2 hours later, took minimal notes, and suggested it was probably just kids pulling a prank. One officer added that if she was moving soon anyway, it wasn't worth investigating. The community helped clean the graffiti, but the message was clear: she wasn't just facing eviction, she was facing forces willing to intimidate and threaten to achieve their goals. Joe appeared as the last of the graffiti was being removed, expressing what seemed like genuine outrage. "Disgraceful," he commented, examining the cleaned surface. Whitmore's tactics have always been ruthless, but this crosses a line. The specificity of his accusation caught Jasmine's attention. "You think Whitmore Enterprises is behind this?" Joe's expression shifted momentarily before he composed himself. "Corporate gentrifiers often employ indirect pressure when legal means prove too slow," he said carefully. "Not that I'm accusing anyone specifically." His backpedaling increased Jasmine's suspicion. That night she decided to follow Joe after he left her food truck. Maintaining a discreet distance, she watched him walk several blocks, his previously stooped posture gradually straightening his pace, becoming more confident with each street he crossed. At the corner of Peachtree Street, the same black luxury car she'd noticed previously pulled alongside him. The rear door opened and Joe entered without hesitation. Jasmine managed to photograph the license plate before the vehicle pulled away. The next morning she confronted Joe when he arrived for his usual meal. "Who are you really?" she demanded quietly, serving him coffee. "I saw you get into that black car last night, the same one that's been watching my truck for weeks." Joe's pale eyes revealed nothing. "I have friends who help me occasionally," he said smoothly. "Just because I'm currently homeless doesn't mean I lack all connections." Jasmine leaned closer. "Does Charles Whitmore know you're spying for him? Or are you working for someone else in the company?" A flicker of something surprised perhaps crossed Joe's features before his expression returned to practiced neutrality. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," he replied. "I have no connection to Whitmore Enterprises." The denial lacked conviction. Jasmine was preparing to press further when her phone chimed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Confidential meeting request, Whitmore Enterprises." The message was brief and formal: "Miss Carter, we would like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding your current situation. Please attend a private meeting at Whitmore Tower tomorrow at 10 a.m. Discretion is appreciated. No signature, just the gold Whitmore logo." The timing immediately after confronting Joe couldn't be coincidental. As Jasmine processed this development, Marcus called with news that their grandmother had been taken to the hospital with complications from her diabetes. The day's events were overwhelming: Joe's deception, the mysterious meeting request, and now Ida's health crisis. At the hospital, doctors explained that Ida needed specialized treatment not covered by her insurance. The cost would be thousands of dollars they didn't have. The trap was tightening from all sides. Her business threatened her grandmother's health, declining financial obstacles deliberately placed in her path, and now this cryptic invitation from the very company orchestrating her difficulties. As Jasmine sat beside her grandmother's hospital bed, holding her frail hand, she contemplated the meeting request. It felt like walking willingly into the lion's den, yet it might be her only opportunity to confront the forces working against her family. The next morning, she stood before the gleaming Whitmore Tower, gathering her courage. Whatever waited inside, she would face it with the same resilience her family had shown for generations against those who sought to erase them from their own neighborhood. She texted Marcus her location and the meeting details, a precaution that felt necessary given the increasingly sinister pattern of events. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked through the imposing glass doors into whatever trap awaited her. The lobby of Whitmore Tower, gleamed with Italian marble, and brushed steel, a monument to wealth and power, rising 40 stories above Atlanta's skyline. Jasmine approached the security desk, conscious of her simple dress and worn leather bag containing her grandmother's property documents. Jasmine Carter for a 10 a.m. meeting, she stated, working to keep her voice steady. The security guard, a white man with military posture, examined her with barely concealed suspicion. "ID," he demanded without looking up from his computer. After scanning her driver's license, he made a call, speaking in hushed tones while occasionally glancing in her direction. Finally, he handed her a visitor badge. 38th floor. Someone will meet you." The elevator whisked her upward glass walls, offering expanding views of the city. She called home, a city increasingly divided between luxury developments and struggling neighborhoods. The historical patterns of segregation were being reinforced through modern gentrification, creating new boundaries as effective as any Jim Crow law. When the elevator doors opened, Marcus stood waiting, his school backpack slung over one shoulder. "I came as soon as I got your text," he said, embracing her. "No way you're facing these people alone." His presence steadied her. At 16, Marcus already stood 6 feet tall, his shoulders squared with determination despite the weight of recent injustices at school. Together they approached the reception desk, where a young white woman with an immaculate blonde bob assessed them with professional detachment. "Miss Carter," she acknowledged, ignoring Marcus entirely. "Please wait here." They sat in sleek leather chairs beneath abstract art pieces that likely cost more than Jasmine would earn in 5 years. The reception area featured framed photographs of Whitmore properties throughout Atlanta, including several buildings that had replaced Black-owned businesses during urban renewal projects. The visual evidence of displacement was displayed as achievement history rewritten from the conqueror's perspective. After 20 minutes, a deliberate power play to establish their unimportance, a door opened, and a woman in her early 40s emerged. Her tailored suit, pearl necklace, and perfectly styled dark hair telegraphed executive authority. "Miss Carter, I'm Patricia Whitmore, Chief Operating Officer and daughter of Charles Whitmore." She extended a manicured hand, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I wasn't informed you'd be bringing anyone." The dismissive glance she gave Marcus made clear he wasn't welcome. "This is my brother and business partner," Jasmine replied firmly. "We make decisions together." Patricia's smile tightened fractionally before she nodded. "Very well. Follow me." She led them through glass doors into a conference room overlooking downtown Atlanta. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view that included Auburn Avenue, where Jasmine's food truck looked tiny from this height, a yellow speck in the shadow of development. The visual metaphor wasn't lost on Jasmine. Patricia gestured toward leather chairs at a polished mahogany table. "Can I offer you anything, water, coffee?" The hospitality felt performative, a thin veneer over the real purpose of this meeting. When they declined, Patricia opened a leather portfolio containing photographs of Jasmine's food truck, customer reviews, and detailed notes about her signature dishes. Soul Food Express has developed quite a following. Patricia began, her tone businesslike. "Our market research indicates significant potential for expansion under proper management." She slid a document across the table. "Whitmore Enterprises is prepared to offer $750,000 to acquire your recipes, brand identity, and business concept." Jasmine stared at the offer, momentarily speechless. The amount would solve their immediate financial problems, pay for grandmother Ida's medical care secure. Marcus's college education provides stable housing. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong. "And what happens to my business? My location?" Patricia's smile became condescending. "The food truck itself isn't part of our acquisition interest. Our restaurant division would incorporate your recipes into a new concept we're developing. Heritage Cuisine will feature various cultural food traditions in an upscale dining format." Jasmine understood the implication immediately. They wanted to strip her cultural heritage, family traditions, and hard work of its context and authenticity, repackaging it for wealthy white consumption while discarding her in the process. This contract includes a non-compete clause and comprehensive NDA. Patricia continued, sliding another document forward. You would be prohibited from operating any food service business within 100 miles of Atlanta for 5 years, and from publicly discussing our acquisition of your recipes." Marcus leaned forward, scanning the fine print. "This says Jasmine would surrender all rights to her grandmother's recipes permanently." He noted his voice tight with controlled anger. "You're not offering partnership. You're erasing her." Patricia's expression hardened. "We're offering fair compensation for intellectual property. Many would consider this quite generous given your current circumstances." The phrase triggered a memory from Jasmine's research. Almost identical language had been used when offering fair compensation to her great-grandfather for property taken through eminent domain. History was repeating itself in modern corporate language. "These recipes aren't just intellectual property." Jasmine responded, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "They're my family's legacy techniques, refined over generations, when black cooks weren't allowed to open restaurants of their own. My great-grandmother created these recipes while working in white households, dreaming of the day her descendants could share them on their own terms." Patricia's expression revealed nothing. "Sentimentality aside, this is business. The neighborhood is changing. Development is inevitable. You can benefit financially or be left behind." The threat was thinly veiled. As they discussed terms, Jasmine noticed subtle similarities between Patricia's mannerisms and Joe's, the same head tilt when considering a response, the same precise way of arranging papers. "Your father seems very interested in my business," Jasmine commented carefully. "I'm surprised he isn't here himself." Patricia's pen paused momentarily. "My father is extremely private. He relies on me to handle most acquisitions." Jasmine pressed further. "Does he often research potential acquisitions personally? Perhaps in disguise?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of reaction crossing Patricia's face before she composed herself. "I'm not sure what you're implying," but her discomfort confirmed Jasmine's suspicion. As the meeting continued, Patricia revealed detailed knowledge of Jasmine's recipes, customer base, and even personal challenges, information only someone who had closely observed her daily operations would know. Information Joe had collected while posing as a homeless man, accepting charity. The betrayal felt visceral. Not only had this powerful white family targeted her business, but they had manipulated her compassion to gather intelligence. They had watched her struggle, accepted her generosity, and planned her displacement while eating food she provided out of kindness. The realization strengthened her resolve. "I'm not interested in selling," Jasmine stated, finally closing the folder containing the offer. "My family's recipes aren't for sale at any price." Patricia's professional veneer cracked slightly. "I strongly suggest you reconsider. The redevelopment is proceeding regardless. This offer represents your only opportunity for compensation." Jasmine stood Marcus, following her lead. "My family has already had one property taken by Whitmore Enterprises. We won't surrender another." She removed her grandmother's documents from her bag, placing them on the table. "These show how your company acquired land from my great-grandfather through fraudulent means. Land that rightfully belongs to my family." Patricia barely glanced at the yellowing papers. "Ancient history, if that documentation is even legitimate. Any legal claim would be long past relevant statutes of limitation." Marcus stepped forward. "Maybe. But how would your investors feel about evidence showing Whitmore's fortune was built on the systematic exploitation of black property owners? Would the heritage cuisine concept seem as appealing if customers knew it was? Just the latest in a long history of appropriation." Patricia's expression hardened. "Are you threatening me, young man?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Just asking questions about ethical business practices and corporate responsibility." Patricia stood, signaling the meeting's end. "I'll have security escort you out." As they were led to the elevator by a stone-faced security guard, Jasmine noticed a frail-looking, elderly white man watching from a partially opened office door. Their eyes met briefly before the man withdrew. She caught only a glimpse, but the pale blue eyes were unmistakable. Joe, now dressed in an expensive suit, his beard trimmed and hair neatly combed. The confirmation of her suspicion felt like a physical blow. Outside Whitmore Tower, Jasmine's phone rang the hospital, calling with news that grandmother Ida's condition had worsened significantly. The specialized treatment needed to save her life would cost tens of thousands of dollars upfront, money they didn't have. The timing created an impossible choice: accept Whitmore's offer to save Ida or reject it to preserve their family legacy. As they hurried toward the hospital, Jasmine's mind raced with the implications of what they'd discovered and the seemingly insurmountable challenges facing them from all sides. The wealth gap created by generations of systemic discrimination now threatened not only their livelihood but their grandmother's life itself, forcing them to consider surrendering their cultural heritage to the very forces that had created their precarious position. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Jasmine. Her compassion in feeding a man she believed homeless had given her enemies the information they needed to more effectively target her business. Yet that same compassion defined who she was and what her food represented to the community. She wouldn't abandon those values even when they had been weaponized against her. At her grandmother's bedside, Jasmine held Ida's frail hand as monitors beeped steadily. The matriarch who had taught her to cook, to persevere, and to maintain dignity in the face of injustice now depended on her to make an impossible decision. The weight of responsibility for her family's past, present, and future pressed down on her shoulders as she contemplated what came next. Would you sacrifice your family's legacy to save someone you love? Or is there always another way if you stand together with your community? Comment number 1. If you believe in the power of collective action against corporate giants. Like and subscribe to see how Jasmine's community comes together to fight back against generations of injustice and exploitation. The story of Jasmine's confrontation with Whitmore Enterprises spread through the neighborhood with the speed of digital wildfire. Marcus had recorded parts of the meeting on his phone and shared key moments on social media, carefully edited to avoid legal repercussions, while clearly showing Patricia Whitmore's dismissive attitude and the predatory nature of their published offer. The hashtag number #SaveSoulFoodExpress began trending locally, bringing customers from across Atlanta to the yellow food truck on Auburn Avenue. Lines formed around the block as people waited hours for a taste of Jasmine's cooking and a chance to show solidarity. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as David versus Goliath, a small black-owned business fighting corporate gentrification. The Atlanta Black Business Association organized a press conference where Jasmine spoke eloquently about the historical pattern of displacement targeting black communities and businesses. "This isn't just about one food truck," she told the assembled reporters. "It's about who has the right to remain in neighborhoods our families built, about whether cultural heritage can be bought and sold, about whether Atlanta's future includes the people who gave this city its soul." Her words resonated beyond her immediate community. Other black business owners facing similar pressure from Whitmore Enterprises and other developers began speaking publicly about their experiences: the mysterious loan rejections, targeted code enforcement, and lowball buyout offers. A pattern emerged of systematic efforts to remove black-owned businesses from areas targeted for upscale development. Malkia Johnson, who owned a bookstore 3 blocks from Jasmine's food truck, revealed that she had also been visited by an elderly white man, asking detailed questions about her business challenges while posing as a customer. The realization that Charles Whitmore had personally surveilled multiple black businesses before targeting them created additional public relations problems for the company. The company's stock price dipped as ethical investors raised concerns. Marcus, tech-savvy and passionate, leveraged social media to document the neighborhood's struggle. His videos contrasting historic Auburn Avenue's vibrant black business district with current demolition sites gained millions of views. He interviewed elders who remembered urban renewal's devastating impact in the 60s, drawing explicit connections to current displacement. "My sister isn't just fighting for her business," Marcus told viewers. "She's fighting against the erasure of our history, our culture, and our economic self-determination. When they take our neighborhoods, they're taking our future too." His advocacy earned him further trouble at school, where administrators warned him about political activities reflecting on the institution. but classmates began asking questions, some joining protests outside Whitmore Tower during weekend demonstrations. The movement grew beyond Jasmine's individual case. Joe, or rather Charles Whitmore, had disappeared from public view. The black car no longer circulated past Jasmine's food truck, and Whitmore Enterprises communicated only through lawyers and press releases, denying any improper business practices. Their official statement claimed they were committed to inclusive development that benefits all Atlanta residents, though they announced no specific changes to their redevelopment plans. While public support grew, Jasmine's practical situation remained precarious. Her grandmother required expensive medical care, the eviction deadline approached, and banks still rejected her loan applications due to the fraudulent negative information in her credit history. The community fundraising campaign had raised $30,000, significant but insufficient for relocating the business and covering medical expenses. The Soul Food Festival, organized as both protest and celebration, transformed Auburn Avenue into a vibrant showcase of Black culinary traditions. 50 vendors representing Southern Caribbean, African, and fusion cuisines set up alongside musicians, artists, and cultural historians. Jasmine's food truck stood at the center, serving her grandmother's recipes to thousands of supporters. Local celebrities made appearances, with several prominent Atlanta musicians performing for free. The festival garnered national media attention, highlighting both the cultural significance of Black food traditions and the threat posed by unchecked development. During festival preparations, Jasmine spent an evening sorting through her grandmother's possessions at the hospital's request, organizing what Ida might need during her extended recovery. In a locked drawer of Ida's bedside table, she discovered a small fireproof box containing documents she hadn't seen during her earlier research: property deeds, surveys, and correspondence, dating back to the 1940s. Most significantly, the box contained proof that the Carter family had never been legally compensated for their Auburn Avenue properties, despite city records claiming otherwise. The documents revealed a complex fraud scheme whereby city officials had redirected compensation funds meant for displaced Black families while falsifying records to show payments had been made. The statute of limitations on fraud had no expiration when government corruption could be proven. Jasmine contacted Ayanna Washington, a paralegal at a civil rights law firm, who had been helping neighborhood businesses with lease reviews. Ayanna's eyes widened as she examined the documents. "This isn't just your family's case," she said, spreading the papers across her desk. "This shows systematic fraud against dozens of families. If we can find similar documentation from other displaced property owners, we could have grounds for a class action lawsuit against both the city and Whitmore Enterprises as beneficiaries of the fraud." The legal path would be long and uncertain, but it offered something previously lacking: leverage. As Jasmine left Ayanna's office, her phone chimed with an alert. Someone had posted a demolition notice on her food truck during the night, dated effective immediately, rather than at the end of the 30-day period originally provided. The accelerated timeline couldn't be coincidental. Whitmore Enterprises was clearly concerned about the growing resistance and sought to eliminate its focal point before the movement could further organize. Jasmine rushed to Auburn Avenue, finding community members already gathered around her food truck, forming a human barrier against any attempt to remove it. Mrs. Washington from the Neighborhood Association had brought folding chairs for elderly participants. Local pastors led prayers, while student activists from nearby universities distributed water bottles and organized shifts to ensure 24-hour protection. The spontaneous mobilization moved Jasmine deeply. Beyond the immediate crisis, the community was reclaiming something precious: the tradition of collective action against injustice that had sustained Black Atlantans through generations of struggle. That evening, as Jasmine served free meals to those protecting her business, a young lawyer named Michael Richardson approached her. He had recently resigned from his position at Whitmore Enterprises' legal department after witnessing the company's response to her case. "They're panicking," he told her quietly. "Your resistance has inspired others. 4 other business owners have refused buyout offers this week alone." The development timeline is threatened, and investors are asking questions. He handed her a flash drive. Internal communications about your case and others. They're systematically targeting black-owned businesses while fast-tracking permits for white entrepreneurs in the same area. There's evidence of coordination with certain city officials to selectively enforce codes against businesses they want removed. The information provided additional ammunition for their growing legal challenge. The continuous protection of community members prevented any attempt to forcibly remove the food truck, while the legal team assembled by Ayanna Washington secured an emergency injunction against the demolition notice, citing evidence of the assembled discriminatory enforcement and the pending investigation into historical property claims. Do you believe in the power of ordinary people to stand against powerful corporations? Has your community ever come together to protect someone when systems failed them? Comment number 2. If you think Jasmine is right to keep fighting, instead of taking the money and walking away. Like this video to support businesses fighting to preserve cultural heritage against gentrification. As the standoff continued, Patricia Whitmore requested another meeting with Jasmine, this time at neutral ground, a conference room at the public library. Unlike their previous encounter in the power setting of Whitmore Tower, Patricia arrived without entourage or security, her expression tense. This situation has escalated unnecessarily. She began her composure slightly fractured. The company is prepared to improve its offer significantly. The new proposal would allow Jasmine to maintain ownership of her recipes while licensing them to Whitmore's restaurant division with ongoing royalties rather than a one-time payment. The eviction would be delayed by 6 months to allow for an orderly transition. Jasmine considered the offer carefully, and the historical claims regarding my family's property, Patricia's expression tightened. Those would need to be settled separately with appropriate confidentiality agreements. The improved offer revealed Whitmore's vulnerability to public pressure, but still required Jasmine to accept displacement as inevitable. As they discussed terms, Jasmine's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Marcus. Their grandmother had suffered a serious setback, and doctors were recommending immediate surgery. The hospital required advance payment due to insurance complications. The timing created maximum pressure to accept Whitmore's offer. Jasmine felt the weight of generations on her shoulders, her ancestors who had built businesses despite segregation, her grandmother who had preserved family recipes through decades of struggle, future generations who would inherit either resistance or surrender as their legacy. The decision before her wasn't simply about one food truck, but about whether patterns established during urban renewal would continue unchallenged into Atlanta's future. The community had shown its readiness to stand with her. The question was whether she would continue leading them toward collective action or accept individual accommodation with the systems that had targeted them all. Dawn broke over Auburn Avenue, painting the historic buildings in soft gold light. Jasmine had spent the night at the hospital with grandmother Ida, whose condition had stabilized following emergency treatment paid for by the community fundraiser. Despite her exhaustion, Jasmine opened the food truck at 5:30 as usual, knowing the community protecting her business needed breakfast. The scent of bacon and coffee drew early risers, including postal workers starting their routes and construction workers heading to nearby sites. By 6:15, a small crowd had gathered, many wearing number Save Soul Food Express t-shirts, designed by local artists. Jasmine noticed the familiar figure approaching from the east. Joe, the supposedly homeless man she now knew, was Charles Whitmore himself. He moved slowly, maintaining his disguise despite her discovery of his true identity. The community members tensed at his approach, many now aware of his connection to Whitmore Enterprises. Jasmine signaled them to stand down, curious about his purpose in continuing the charade. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the practiced humility that now seemed grotesque in its deception. "Might I speak with you privately?" Jasmine gestured toward a small table set up beside the food truck. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here," she replied, aware of Marcus recording the interaction from nearby. Joe, or rather Charles Whitmore, glanced uncomfortably at the witnesses before sitting down. For several moments he maintained the character, hunched shoulders and trembling hands, completing the performance. Then, like a theater actor, changing roles, his posture straightened. The tremor disappeared from his hands. His voice deepened and gained authority. "I see continued pretense serves no purpose," he said, meeting Jasmine's eyes directly. "I am Charles Whitmore." Gasps and murmurs spread through the onlookers. Despite suspecting the truth, seeing the transformation was jarring. The frail homeless man who had accepted her charity was gone, replaced by a powerful businessman whose decisions affected thousands of lives. The audacity of his deception, a billionaire posing as destitute to study her business, struck Jasmine anew. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why the disguise? Why target my business?" Whitmore's pale blue eyes assessed her carefully. "I've found that people reveal their true character when they believe no one important is watching. You showed kindness to a homeless man expecting nothing in return. That's rare." The explanation disguised the fundamental exploitation of his actions, using her compassion as an intelligence-gathering technique. "And having confirmed my true character, you decided to destroy my business anyway," Jasmine observed, keeping her voice steady despite her anger. Whitmore frowned slightly. "Business isn't personal. Development requires change. Your food truck doesn't maximize the potential of that location." The coldness of his calculation, reducing her family legacy, community service, and livelihood to a simple equation of property value, epitomized the system she fought against. "I have a proposal," Whitmore continued, placing a folder on the table. "Better than what my daughter offered. $1 million for your brand and recipes, plus minority ownership in the new restaurant concept. You could be wealthy and still connected to your culinary traditions." Marcus stepped forward, phone still recording. "And your company keeps its reputation for inclusive development without actually including the existing community." Whitmore's expression hardened at the interruption. "Young man, you don't understand business realities. This neighborhood will change regardless of what happens to one food truck. I'm offering your sister the opportunity to benefit rather than become another casualty of progress." The framing revealed his perspective change. Benefiting people like him was inevitable, natural, even moral, while resistance was futile and irrational. Jasmine opened the folder, reviewing the offer while maintaining her composure. The terms were indeed generous financially, but still required surrendering control of her family recipes and accepting the displacement of her business. "And what about this?" She placed her grandmother's property documents on the table. "My family's buildings that Whitmore Enterprises acquired through fraudulent urban renewal programs." His compensation for those included. Whitmore barely glanced at the yellowing papers. "Ancient history. Any legal claim is long expired. Not when government corruption is involved," Jasmine countered. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply. We've found similar documentation from 15 other families whose properties were taken through the same scheme." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Whitmore's face. "Those claims would be against the city, not my company. We purchased properties legally from municipal authorities. Your father was directly involved in creating the fraudulent urban renewal plan," Jasmine said quietly. "We have correspondence between him and city officials detailing which properties they wanted seized before any public plan was announced. The conspiracy makes Whitmore Enterprises liable as well." Whitmore's expression darkened. "Where did you get that information?" "My grandmother kept everything," Jasmine replied. "As did other families. We've learned from history. When systems are designed to erase you, documentation becomes resistance." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's sharp intake of breath. He turned his phone screen toward Jasmine, showing breaking news. Charles Whitmore had reportedly suffered a stroke the previous evening and was hospitalized in critical condition. The article included a photograph of Whitmore being transported by ambulance. Jasmine looked up at the very much alive man sitting across from her, understanding dawning. "You faked a medical emergency to explain your absence while meeting me in disguise," she said, the pieces falling into place. "Creating an alibi, in case your identity was discovered." Whitmore's composure slipped momentarily before he regained control. Prudent precautions in a hostile media environment. Marcus continued recording as Jasmine confronted the billionaire. "Let me make sure I understand. You disguised yourself as homeless to spy on black businesses in neighborhoods you plan to gentrify. You sabotaged my loan applications and credit history. You accelerated my eviction when I refused to sell, and now you're faking medical emergencies to cover your activities." Her voice remained calm, but carried moral authority that made Whitmore shift uncomfortably. "When you put it that way, certain actions might seem questionable out of context." Whitmore conceded reluctantly. "Business sometimes requires unconventional approaches to due diligence." Marcus scoffed audibly. "That's what you call racial discrimination and predatory business practices, unconventional due diligence." Whitmore turned to him, mask slipping to reveal contempt. "Listen, boy. My name is Marcus Carter." Marcus interrupted, his voice steady, despite the racial provocation. "And I'm recording your use of discriminatory language and admission of fraudulent business practices." Whitmore's face flushed with anger. "You're recording without consent. That's illegal in Georgia." "Actually," Marcus replied, "Georgia is a one-party consent state for recordings. I consent to recording this conversation about matters of public interest involving racial discrimination by a public figure." The legal knowledge from a 16-year-old visibly unsettled Whitmore. Jasmine reclaimed control of the conversation. "Here's my counteroffer," she said, closing his proposal folder and sliding it back toward him. "Whitmore Enterprises will halt all eviction proceedings against businesses in this neighborhood, pending independent investigation of your company's practices. You'll establish a community development fund controlled by neighborhood representatives to support existing businesses. And you'll formally acknowledge your company's benefit from historical property seizures by creating a reparations program for affected families." Whitmore's laugh held no humor. "That's not a counteroffer. That's a surrender document. It's accountability," Jasmine corrected. "Something your company has avoided for generations." Whitmore stood, abandoning all pretense of humility. "You're making a grave mistake. Nobody wins by fighting progress." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. "I've built this company over 40 years. I've overcome far more significant obstacles than one food truck operator with delusions of historical justice." As he turned to leave, Marcus held up his phone. "Mr. Whitmore, this recording shows you impersonating a homeless person to gather business intelligence, making racially charged remarks, and implying threats against my sister's business. Are you sure you want this released to the media? Your shareholders might have questions about your methods." Whitmore's expression darkened further. "That would be unwise, young man. Whitmore Enterprises has legal resources you can't imagine. We could destroy your family completely." Marcus continued recording as Whitmore revealed his true character, and that Marcus replied calmly, "is exactly the evidence we needed of your business ethics and racial attitudes." Whitmore seemed to suddenly realize the trap he'd walked into, his face paling slightly. "Delete that recording immediately." His command carried the expectation of lifetime obedience. "Or what?" Jasmine asked, standing beside her brother. "You'll continue the same tactics you've already been using. The difference is that now we have evidence. The choice is yours. Work with the community on equitable development, or become the public face of corporate racism in Atlanta." The confrontation represented generations of imbalanced power suddenly shifting. Whitmore's expression revealed a man encountering resistance he couldn't simply purchase or intimidate away. "This isn't over," he said, finally turning to leave with as much dignity as he could muster. "My attorneys will contact you." As he walked away, the community members who had witnessed the exchange surrounded Jasmine and Marcus, offering support and congratulations on standing firm. Yet Jasmine felt no triumph, only the sobering reality that powerful interests rarely surrendered without deploying every weapon in their considerable arsenal. The real battle was just beginning, and her grandmother remained hospitalized, her business still under threat and her future uncertain. But for the first time, she possessed leverage and evidence that could potentially change not just her situation, but the pattern of displacement that had targeted Black communities for generations. Jasmine gathered her allies around a large table in the community center basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she spread documents, maps, and legal papers across the scarred wooden surface. Present were Marcus, Ayanna Washington, the paralegal building their legal case, Reverend Jackson from First Baptist Church, Mrs. Turner from the Neighborhood Association, Michael Richardson, the former Whitmore Enterprises lawyer, and representatives from 6 other black-owned businesses facing similar displacement. Whitmore won't back down easily. Jasmine began her voice steady despite her exhaustion. We need a coordinated strategy, attacking multiple pressure points simultaneously. The multi-pronged approach took shape over the next 3 hours. They would pursue legal action based on the historical property claims and evidence of current discriminatory practices. Media pressure would continue through strategic release of information about Whitmore's deceptive tactics. Community organizing would maintain physical presence protecting threatened businesses, and direct appeals to Whitmore board members and investors would target the company's financial interests. Corporations respond to 3 things Michael explained, drawing from his insider knowledge: legal liability, public relations, damage, and financial impact. We need to create pressure in all 3 areas simultaneously. The video of Charles Whitmore's true identity revelation and subsequent threats provided a powerful catalyst. Marcus had edited it carefully to highlight the most damning moments while ensuring it couldn't be dismissed as manipulated or out of context. After consultation with their legal advisors, they released the video to selected media outlets and social media platforms simultaneously. The impact exceeded their expectations. Within hours, the hashtag #WhitmoreExposed was trending nationally. Business publications ran stories questioning the company's ethics and tactics. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the targeting of black businesses. Whitmore Enterprises stock dropped 12% in a single day as investors worried about potential lawsuits and reputational damage. The company's initial response, claiming the video was selectively edited and that Charles Whitmore had been conducting community outreach research, only intensified scrutiny. Financial analysts began examining the company's development patterns, confirming what Jasmine had discovered: Whitmore systematically targeted. Historically, black neighborhoods replaced existing businesses with upscale establishments and extracted community wealth while creating few opportunities for original residents. Inside Whitmore Enterprises, the video created unexpected turmoil. 3 black executives resigned in protest, including the Vice President of Community Relations, who released a statement saying she could no longer represent a company whose leadership holds such views toward the communities we claim to serve. Corporate partners began distancing themselves, with 2 national brands canceling collaboration agreements, citing values misalignment. The legal team, assembled by Ayanna Washington, grew as civil rights attorneys recognized the potential landmark nature of the case. The combination of historical documentation showing fraudulent property seizures and current evidence of discriminatory practices created grounds for both civil rights claims and potential racketeering charges against Whitmore Enterprises. The class action lawsuit took shape as more families came forward with documentation of properties taken during urban renewal. As public pressure mounted, Jasmine received a surprising message from Patricia Whitmore requesting a confidential meeting. They met at a neutral location, a private room at the public library with attorneys present. Patricia appeared strained, the corporate polish diminished by obvious stress. "My father's methods were unknown to me," she began, though her claims seemed dubious given the detailed knowledge she demonstrated in their previous meeting. "The board is concerned about the direction this conflict is taking." She offered a revised proposal. Whitmore Enterprises would delay redevelopment plans for 6 months to allow for community input, establish a $1 million small business support fund, and consider historical claims individually through Estate, a company-managed process. The offer represented movement, but maintained Whitmore's control of both the development process and historical reconciliation. Jasmine, consulting with her advisors, declined the proposal as insufficient. "The community needs structural change, not charity," she explained. "Any acceptable solution must include community ownership stakes in redevelopment and independent evaluation of historical claims." Patricia's frustration was evident. "You're asking a private corporation to surrender its business model and admit historical liability. That's not realistic." Jasmine's response was measured but firm. "We're asking a company that benefited from documented fraud to make amends and adopt ethical practices moving forward. If that requires changing your business model, perhaps the original approach wasn't sustainable without exploitation." As negotiations stalled, Jasmine expanded her investigation into Whitmore's operations. Michael Richardson's inside knowledge proved invaluable, directing them to examine the company's philanthropic activities, specifically how Charles Whitmore had cultivated an image of generosity while maximizing tax benefits and public relations value. The pattern that emerged was revealing Whitmore donated primarily to elite cultural institutions frequented by wealthy white patrons, symphony orchestras, art museums, ballet companies. These donations generated tax write-offs, naming opportunities, and social capital among the city's powerful, while creating no benefit for communities displaced by his developments. More damaging was the discovery that Whitmore Enterprises had established a foundation that purchased cultural artifacts from communities they later redeveloped, acquiring historical items at low prices before displacement occurred. Then, donating them to museums at inflated valuations for substantial tax benefits. The practice allowed them to profit even from the cultural heritage of communities they destroyed. As this information became public, the narrative shifted from one businessman's questionable tactics to a systematic exploitation of Black communities spanning generations. The legal case expanded accordingly, with plaintiffs now numbering over 60 families and businesses. Jasmine worked tirelessly, dividing her time between the hospital where grandmother Ida was slowly recovering, the food truck, where community support remained strong, and strategy sessions with their growing coalition. The constant pressure took its toll. She lost weight, slept little, and sometimes found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility of representing not just her business, but a community's historical grievances. Marcus provided unwavering support, managing social media campaigns and coordinating with student activists, while maintaining his schoolwork through independent study arrangements. His teacher, Mr. Peterson, had been placed on administrative leave, pending investigation of discriminatory grading practices following testimony from multiple students inspired by Marcus's stand. Throughout this period, Jasmine and her supporters faced escalating intimidation. Suspicious vehicles parked outside their homes. Anonymous threatening messages appeared on their social media accounts. Health inspectors suddenly discovered violations at supportive businesses. Tax audits were initiated against coalition members. Rather than cowering, they documented each incident, adding them to the legal complaint as evidence of continuing discrimination and retaliation. The coordinated resistance was unprecedented in recent Atlanta history, uniting communities across racial and economic lines against development practices that threatened to erase the city's cultural heritage and displace its historic residents. National media began covering the story as emblematic of conflicts occurring in gentrifying cities nationwide. As pressure intensified, Jasmine received concerning information from an anonymous source within Whitmore Enterprises. The company was preparing a major counteroffensive, including private investigators examining every aspect of coalition, members' lives, seeking vulnerabilities, and plans to accelerate demolition of nearby vacant properties to create safety concerns, justifying emergency removal of her food truck. The warning allowed them to prepare, documenting the building's current condition and securing affidavits from structural engineers, confirming they posed no immediate safety risk. The anticipated emergency order never materialized, suggesting their preemptive actions had deterred the strategy. Instead, Patricia Whitmore called an emergency press conference, announcing her father was taking medical leave due to health concerns, with her assuming temporary leadership of the company. She promised a thorough review of community engagement practices and meaningful dialogue with all stakeholders. The carefully worded statement neither admitted wrongdoing nor committed to specific changes, but represented the first public acknowledgement that the company's approach might require adjustment. That evening, as Jasmine closed the food truck, she received an unexpected visitor. A security guard from Whitmore Tower, delivered an envelope containing a handwritten note from Charles Whitmore himself, requesting a private meeting at Piedmont Hospital where he was apparently receiving treatment. The note emphasized confidentiality and promised a resolution beneficial to all parties. The request created an ethical dilemma. Meeting privately with Whitmore might undermine the coalition's united front and create suspicion about secret deals. Yet the opportunity to confront the architect of both historical and current displacement strategies offered potential advantages. After consultation with key allies, Jasmine decided to accept the meeting, but with conditions Marcus would accompany her. They would inform their legal team of the discussion contents afterward, and they would make no agreements without coalition approval. As they prepared for this unexpected development, Jasmine reflected on how far they had come from her initial isolation facing eviction. Through revealing historical patterns and building collective resistance, they had transformed an individual business struggle into a movement for economic justice that challenged generations of discriminatory practices. Whatever Whitmore intended by this private meeting, the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. No longer was he the unseen billionaire studying her from disguise while she struggled alone. Now he sought her audience, while a community stood behind her, demanding accountability for past harms and equitable participation in future development. Piedmont Hospital's VIP wing bore little resemblance to the crowded emergency room where grandmother Ida had waited hours for treatment. Plush carpeting muffled footsteps, original artwork adorned walls, and private nurses attended to wealthy patients in spacious suites. The contrast between healthcare experiences based on wealth status wasn't lost on Jasmine and Marcus as they were escorted to Charles Whitmore's private room. The security guard checked their identification before allowing them entry. Inside, medical equipment beeped quietly beside a hospital bed where Charles Whitmore rested, looking significantly older without his disguise or corporate armor. Intravenous lines ran into his arm and a heart monitor displayed his vitals on a screen. His daughter Patricia stood by the window, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," Whitmore said, his voice weaker than during their confrontation. "Please, sit down." Jasmine and Marcus remained standing, maintaining both literal and figurative positions of strength. "You wanted to meet," Jasmine stated simply. "We're listening." Whitmore gestured weakly toward Patricia, who closed the door to ensure privacy. "What I'm about to say doesn't leave this room unless we reach an agreement," he began. Marcus immediately objected. "We're not making secret deals. Anything affecting the community will be discussed with our coalition." Whitmore's pale eyes revealed momentary anger before he composed himself. "Fine, but hear me out completely before you decide." He adjusted his position, wincing slightly. "I've had a minor cardiac event, not the stroke reported in the media, but significant enough to focus one's thoughts on legacy." The admission that the earlier medical emergency had indeed been fabricated confirmed Jasmine's suspicions about Whitmore's deceptive tactics. "For 40 years, I've built this company using methods I believed necessary in a competitive industry. I've created thousands of jobs, revitalized declining areas, and generated substantial wealth for shareholders and partners." His self-justification sounded rehearsed, a narrative he'd likely repeated to himself over decades to rationalize his actions. "The methods your father established," Jasmine interjected. "Methods targeting black neighborhoods for revitalization that somehow always resulted in original residents and businesses being displaced." Whitmore's expression tightened. "Urban renewal was government policy, not my creation." "But your father exploited it," Marcus countered. "And you've continued the same approach using different terminology. The documents prove it." A tense silence filled the room before Whitmore continued. "I began my disguise as Joe primarily as a security measure. After receiving death threats from anti-development activists, I wanted to observe project areas personally without recognition." The explanation rang hollow, but Jasmine allowed him to continue. "What I didn't anticipate was how the experience would affect me. Spending months among people I previously viewed only as abstract obstacles to progress, it changes perspective." He looked directly at Jasmine. "Watching you feed me a stranger, you believed homeless despite your own financial struggles, observing how communities support each other when systems fail them. It revealed aspects of neighborhood value not captured in property assessments or financial projections. The admission seemed genuine, though it didn't erase the fundamental exploitation of his approach. "You saw our humanity, but still proceeded with plans to displace us," Jasmine observed. "That's worse than ignorance. It's conscious choice to harm communities you knew had value." Whitmore didn't immediately respond, his monitor showing slightly elevated heart rate. Patricia intervened, her tone professional but strained. "My father has authorized me to negotiate comprehensive settlement terms. We recognize that continuing this public conflict serves neither Whitmore Enterprises' interests nor the community's immediate needs." She outlined a proposal significantly different from previous offers. Whitmore Enterprises would establish a community development corporation with neighborhood representatives controlling 51% of voting rights. The corporation would have right of first refusal on any property Whitmore developed in historically black neighborhoods. 20% of residential units in new developments would be permanently affordable for original neighborhood residents. Historic properties would be preserved rather than demolished. Most significantly, the company would fund independent investigation of historical property claims, with binding arbitration determining appropriate compensation for families whose property had been taken through fraudulent means. "These terms represent fundamental change in our business approach," Patricia concluded. "We're prepared to make this settlement public and legally binding through appropriate court procedures." The proposal contained most elements Jasmine's coalition had demanded, though questions remained about implementation and oversight. "And what about immediate concerns?" Marcus asked. "The eviction notices the businesses currently facing displacement." "Grandmother's medical bills." Charles Whitmore spoke again, his voice steadier. "All eviction proceedings against businesses in the coalition will be immediately suspended pending development of transition plans acceptable to all parties. As a personal matter, not part of any legal settlement, I'll establish a health care fund for residents impacted by development activities, including retroactive coverage for your grandmother's expenses." The offer was substantial, addressing both systemic issues and immediate needs. Yet Jasmine remained cautious. "Why the change? A week ago you were threatening to destroy us if the recording became public." Whitmore exchanged glances with Patricia before responding. "Multiple factors. The legal exposure from historical documentation your coalition assembled, the shareholder pressure following media coverage of our methods, my own health situation, creating succession planning concerns." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "And perhaps watching someone who had every reason to be bitter, continuing to show kindness to others, affected me more than I realized." The moment felt significant. A powerful man accustomed to reshaping cities according to his vision, acknowledging impact from a young woman he had intended to displace. Not redemption, certainly, but perhaps the beginning of accountability. "We need to discuss this with our full coalition," Jasmine said finally. "Any agreement must have community ownership and transparency." Patricia nodded. "We understand. We're prepared to meet with designated representatives to finalize terms." As they prepared to leave, Whitmore spoke again. "Miss Carter, regardless of how negotiations conclude, I want you to know that watching you maintain dignity and generosity despite the obstacles placed before you, it changed something in me. Too late, perhaps, for genuine atonement, but possibly in time to begin correcting historical wrongs." The acknowledgement couldn't erase generations of harm, but it represented a shift in power dynamics that seemed almost impossible weeks earlier. Outside the hospital, Jasmine and Marcus debriefed with their legal team before calling an emergency coalition meeting. The discussion lasted well into the night, with community members expressing both cautious optimism about the unprecedented concessions and justifiable skepticism about Whitmore's sincerity. They ultimately developed a counter-proposal, strengthening enforcement mechanisms and expanding community control provisions. 3 weeks of intensive negotiations followed, resulting in a settlement agreement that transformed both Whitmore Enterprises' development approach and the future of historically black neighborhoods in Atlanta. The company publicly acknowledged its historical benefit from discriminatory practices and established substantial reparation funds for affected families. The settlement included returning certain properties to original families with compensation for decades of lost opportunity. Most significantly, it created a new model of development, requiring meaningful participation from existing communities in planning and ownership of neighborhood changes. 6 months later, Jasmine expanded Soul Food Express into a cooperative business model, employing neighborhood youth and teaching culinary entrepreneurship. As Jasmine left Ayana's office, her phone chimed with an alert. Someone had posted a demolition notice on her food truck during the night, dated effective immediately, rather than at the end of the 30-day period originally provided. The accelerated timeline couldn't be coincidental. Whitmore Enterprises was clearly concerned about the growing resistance and sought to eliminate its focal point before the movement could further organize. Grandmother Ida recovered sufficiently to advise on menu development and share additional family recipes previously kept secret. The settlement's impact extended beyond individual businesses. Other development companies faced increased scrutiny of their practices, with several adopting similar community partnership approaches to avoid comparable conflicts. Neighborhood associations gained unprecedented leverage in negotiating development terms. The legal precedent established by the class action settlement created pathways for similar claims in other cities where urban renewal had displaced Black communities. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Jasmine catered a community celebration marking the first anniversary of the settlement agreement. As residents gathered in the small park beside her restaurant, she noticed Charles Whitmore himself at the periphery, walking with a cane, but no longer maintaining any pretense of disguise. The enterprise operated from a permanent location in a renovated historic building, one previously owned by her great-grandfather, and returned to family ownership through the settlement process. Marcus received a full college scholarship from the newly established Whitmore Community Foundation, though he deferred enrollment to spend a year documenting neighborhood histories throughout Atlanta, preserving stories of resilience that might otherwise be lost to gentrification. Jasmine nodded, acknowledging both the compliment and the changed dynamic between them. The Community Development Council meets Tuesday to review the next phase of the neighborhood plan, she replied. Will you attend or send Patricia? I'll be there, he answered. Some transformations require personal presence to remain meaningful. As he moved away, Jasmine reflected on how their confrontation had altered both their trajectories, her family reclaiming stolen legacy and expanding opportunity for others. Whitmore, beginning the long process of addressing harms his family had perpetuated for generations. The change wasn't redemption. Genuine justice would require dismantling systems of privilege and discrimination far beyond one company's practices. But it represented possibility, that communities armed with historical truth and collective action could challenge powerful interests and begin bending the arc of development toward justice. What would you do if someone who deceived you offered $1 million for your family legacy? Would you take the money or stand and fight for something more valuable than cash? Comment below with your thoughts on Jasmine's choice, fight rather than sell out. Like and subscribe if you believe in standing up for your community against powerful forces trying to erase your history. Share this story with someone facing their own David versus Goliath battle who needs inspiration to keep fighting. Thank you for following Jasmine's journey from a simple act of kindness to a movement that transformed her city. Sometimes the smallest actions, like feeding a stranger, can set in motion changes that affect generations to come. This story teaches us that standing firm against injustice, even when facing powerful opponents, can transform not just individual lives, but entire systems. Jasmine's refusal to sell her family's legacy revealed the strength that comes from understanding history and recognizing patterns of exploitation. Her journey shows how discrimination often wears sophisticated disguises, appearing as progress, development, or business reality, while continuing historical patterns of displacement. The power of community stands at the heart of this narrative. When Jasmine could have accepted individual compensation and walked away, she instead chose collective action that addressed generational harms. Her choice reminds us that true wealth lies not just in financial resources, but in cultural heritage, community bonds, and the dignity of self-determination. The story also illuminates how compassion, even when temporarily weaponized against us, ultimately represents our greatest strength. Jasmine's kindness toward Joe eventually became the catalyst for transformation, proving that humanity can penetrate even the most hardened systems of privilege. Perhaps most importantly, this journey demonstrates that accountability is possible. When communities document their histories, build coalitions, and demand recognition of past injustices, they create pathways toward more equitable futures, where development includes, rather than displaces, preserves, rather than erases, and honors, rather than exploits the communities that give neighborhoods their soul. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up against powerful interests to protect their community or heritage? Or perhaps you've experienced discrimination disguised as progress in your own neighborhood. Share your story in the comments. Below, your experience might inspire others facing similar challenges. If this story of resilience against systemic injustice resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others discover it. Subscribe for more powerful narratives that explore the hidden struggles and triumphs happening in communities across America. Would you have made the same choice as Jasmine? Would you fight for justice and community even when offered a $1 million escape route? Comment legacy if you believe some things are too valuable to sell at any price. Thank you for joining us on Jasmine's journey from a simple act of kindness to a movement that transformed her city. May we all find the courage to feed strangers, stand against injustice, and transform systems that were never built to include us. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that David can still triumph over Goliath.